The Outline of Sanity by GK Chesterton. Narrated by Seth Trey. Chapter 1. Some General Ideas. Section 1. The Beginning of the Quarrel. I have been asked to republish these notes, which appeared in a weekly paper, is a rough sketch of certain aspects of the institution of private property, now so completely forgotten amid the journalistic jubilations over private enterprise. The very fact that the publicists say so much of the latter and so little of the former is a measure of the moral tone of the times. A pickpocket is obviously a champion of private enterprise, but it would perhaps be an exaggeration to say that a pickpocket is a champion of private property. The point about capitalism and commercialism is conducted of late is that they have really preached the extension of business rather than the preservation of belongings, and have at best tried to disguise the pickpocket with some of the virtues of the pirate. The point about communism is that it only reforms the pickpocket by forbidding pockets. Pockets, and positions generally, seem to me to have not only a more normal, but a more dignified defence than the rather dirty individualism that talks about private enterprise. In the hope that it may possibly help others to understand it, I have decided to reproduce these studies as they stand, hasty, and sometimes merely topical as they were. It is indeed very hard to reproduce them in this form, because they were editorial notes to a controversy largely conducted by others, but the general idea is at least present. In any case, private enterprise is no very noble way of stating the truth of one of the 10 Commandments, but there was at least a time when it was more or less true. The Manchester radicals preached a rather crude and cruel sort of competition, but at least they practiced what they preached. The newspapers, now praising private enterprise, are preaching the very opposite of anything that anybody dreams of practicing. The practical tendency of all trade and business today is toward big commercial combinations, often more imperial, more impersonal, more international than many a communist commonwealth, things that are at least collective, if not collectivist. It is all very well to repeat distractedly, "What are we coming to with all this Bolshevism?" It is equally relevant to add, what are we coming to even without Bolshevism? The obvious answer is monopoly. It is certainly not private enterprise. The American trust is not private enterprise. It would be truer to call the Spanish Inquisition private judgment. Monopoly is neither private nor enterprising. It exists to prevent private enterprise. In that system of trust or monopoly, that complete destruction of property would still be the present goal of all our progress if there were not a Bolshevist in the world. Now, I am one of those who believe that the cure for centralization is decentralization. It has been described as a paradox. There is apparently something elvish and fantastic about saying that when capital has come to be too much in the hand of the few, the right thing is to restore it into the hands of the many. The socialist would put it in the hands of even fewer people, but those people would be politicians who, as we know, always administer it in the interests of the many. But before I put before the reader things written in the very thick of the current controversy, I foresee it will be necessary to preface them with these few paragraphs, explaining a few of the terms and amplifying a few of the assumptions. I was in the weekly paper arguing with people who knew the shorthand of this particular argument, but to be clearly understood, we must begin with a few definitions, or at least descriptions. I assure the reader that I use words in quite a definite sense, but it is possible that he may use them in a different sense, and a muddle and misunderstanding of that sort does not even rise to the dignity of a difference of opinion. For instance, capitalism is really a very unpleasant word. It is also a very unpleasant thing. Yet the thing I have in mind, when I say so, is quite definite and definable, only the name is a very unworkable word for it. But obviously we must have some word for it. When I say capitalism, I commonly mean something that may be stated thus: that economic condition in which there is a class of capitalists roughly recognizable and relatively small, in whose possession so much of the capital is concentrated as to necessitate a very large majority of the citizens serving those capitalists for a wage. This particular state of things can and does exist, and we must have some word for it, in some way of discussing it. But this is undoubtedly a very bad word, because it is used by other people to mean quite other things. Some people seem to mean merely private property. Others suppose that capitalism must mean anything involving the use of capital. But if that use is too literal, it is also too loose and even too large. If the use of capital is capitalism, then everything is capitalism. Bolshevism is capitalism, and anarchist communism is capitalism, and every revolutionary scheme, however wild, is still capitalism. Lenin and Trotsky believed as much as Lloyd George and Thomas that the economic operations of today must leave something over for the economic operations of tomorrow. And that is all that capital means in its economic sense. In that case, the word is useless. My use of it may be arbitrary, but it is not useless. If capitalism means private property, I am capitalist. If capitalism means capital, everybody is capitalist. But if capitalism means this particular condition of capital, only paid out to the masses in the form of wages, then it does mean something, even if it ought to mean something else. The truth is that what we call capitalism ought to be called proletarianism. The point of it is not that some people have capital, but that most people only have wages because they do not have capital. I have made an heroic effort in my time to walk about the world always saying proletarianism instead of capitalism, but my path has been a thorny one of troubles and misunderstandings. I find that when I criticize the Duke of Northumberland for his proletarianism, my meaning does not get home. When I say I should often agree with the Morning Post if it were not so deplorably proletarian, there seems to be some strange momentary impediment to the complete communion of mind with mind. Yet that would be strictly accurate, for what I complain of in the current defence of existing capitalism is that it is a defence of keeping most men in wage dependence, that is, keeping most men without capital. I am not the sort of precisian who prefers conveying correctly what he doesn't mean, rather than conveying incorrectly what he does. I am totally indifferent to the term as compared to the meaning. I do not care whether I call one thing or the other by this mere printed word beginning with a C, so long as it is applied to one thing and not the other. I do not mind using a term as arbitrary as a mathematical sign, if it is accepted like a mathematical sign. I do not mind calling property X in capitalism Y, so long as nobody thinks it necessary to say that X equals Y. I do not mind saying cat for capitalism and dog for distributism, so long as people understand that the things are different enough to fight like cat and dog. The proposal of the wider distribution of capital remains the same whatever we call it, or whatever we call the present glaring contradiction of it. It is the same whether we state it by saying that there is too much capitalism in the one sense, or too little capitalism in the other, and it is really quite pedantic to say that the use of capital must be capitalist. We might as fairly say that anything social must be socialist, that socialism can be identified with a social evening or a social glass, which, I grieve to say, is not the case. Nevertheless, there is enough verbal vagueness about socialism to call for a word of definition. Socialism is a system which makes the corporate unity of society responsible for all its economic processes, or all those affecting life and essential living. If anything important is sold, the government has sold it. If anything important is given, the government has given it. If anything important is even tolerated, the government is responsible for tolerating it. This is the very reverse of anarchy. It is an extreme enthusiasm for authority. It is in many ways worthy of the moral dignity of the mind. It is a collective acceptance of very complete responsibility. But it is silly of socialists to complain of our saying that it must be a destruction of liberty. It is almost equally silly of anti-socialists to complain of the unnatural and unbalanced brutality of the Bolshevist government in crushing a political opposition. A socialist government is one which, in its nature, does not tolerate any true and real opposition, for there the government provides everything, and it is absurd to ask a government to provide an opposition. You cannot go to the Sultan and say reproachfully, "You have made no arrangements for your brother dethroning you and seizing the caliphate." You cannot go to a medieval king and say, "Kindly lend me 2,000 spears and 1,000 bowmen, as I wish to raise rebellion against you." Still less can you reproach a government which professes to set up everything, because it has not set up anything to pull down all it has set up. Opposition and rebellion depend on property and liberty. They can only be tolerated where other rights have been allowed to strike root, besides the central right of the ruler. Those rights must be protected by a morality which even the ruler will hesitate to defy. The critic of the state can only exist where a religious sense of right protects his claim to his own bow and spear, or at least to his own pen and his own printing press. It is absurd to suppose that he could borrow the royal pen to advocate regicide, or use the government printing presses to expose the corruption of the government. Yet it is the whole point of socialism, the whole case for socialism, that unless all printing presses are government printing presses, printers may be oppressed. Everything is staked on the state's justice. It is putting all the eggs in one basket. Many of them will be rotten eggs, but even then you will not be allowed to use them at political elections. About 15 years ago, a few of us began to preach in the old New Age and New Witness a policy of small distributed property, which has since assumed the awkward but accurate name of distributism, as we should have said then, against the two extremes of capitalism and communism. The first criticism we received was from the most brilliant Fabians, especially Mr. Bernard Shaw. In the form which that first criticism took was simply to tell us that our ideal was impossible. It was only a case of Catholic credulity about fairy tales. The law of rent and other economic laws made it inevitable that the little rivulets of property should run down into the pool of plutocracy. In truth, it was the Fabian wit, and not merely the Tory fool, who confronted our visions with that venerable verbal opening, "If it were all divided up tomorrow." Nevertheless, we had an answer even in those days, and though we have since found many others, it will clarify the question if I repeat this point of principle. It is true that I believe in fairy tales, in the sense that I marvel so much at what does exist that I am the readier to admit what might. I understand the man who believes in the sea serpent on the ground that there are more fish in the sea than ever came out of it. But I do it the more because the other man, in his ardour for disproving the sea serpent, always argues that there are not only no snakes in Iceland, but none in the world. Suppose Mr. Bernard Shaw, commenting on this credulity, were to blame me for believing, on the words of some lying priest, that stones could be thrown up into the air and hang there suspended, like a rainbow. Suppose he told me tenderly that I should not believe this popish fable of the magic stones if I had ever had the law of gravity scientifically explained to me. And suppose, after all this, I found he was only talking about the impossibility of building an arch. I think most of us would form two main conclusions about him and his school. First, we should think them very ill-informed about what is really meant by recognizing a law of nature. A law of nature can be recognized by resisting it, or outmaneuvering it, or even using it against itself, as in the case of the arch. And second, and much more strongly, we should think them astonishingly ill-informed about what has already been done upon this earth. Similarly, the first fact in the discussion of whether small properties can exist is the fact that they do exist. It is a fact almost equally unmistakable that they not only exist, but endure. Mr. Shaw affirmed in a sort of abstract fury that small properties will not stay small. Now, it is interesting to note here that the opponents of anything like a several proprietary bring two highly inconsistent charges against it. They are perpetually telling us that the peasant life in Latin or other countries is monotonous, is unprogressive, is covered with weedy superstitions, and is a sort of survival of the Stone Age. Yet even while they taunt us with its survival, they argue that it can never survive. They point to the peasant as a perennial stick in the mud, and then refuse to plant him anywhere on the specific ground that he would not stick. Now, the first of the two types of denunciation is arguable enough, but in order to denounce peasantries, the critic must admit that there are peasantries to denounce. And if it were true that they always tended rapidly to disappear, it would not be true that they exhibited those primitive customs and conservative opinions, which they not only do in fact exhibit, but which the critics reproached them with exhibiting. They cannot, in common sense, accuse a thing at once of being antiquated and of being ephemeral. It is, of course, the dry fact, to be seen in broad daylight, that small peasant properties are not ephemeral. But anyhow, Mr. Shaw and his school must not say that arches cannot be built, and then that they disfigure the landscape. The distributive state is not a hypothesis for him to demolish. It is a phenomenon for him to explain. The truth is that the conception that small property evolves into capitalism is a precise picture of what practically never takes place. The truth is attested even by facts of geography, facts which, as it seems to me, have been strangely overlooked. 9 times out of 10, an industrial civilization of the modern capitalist type does not arise. Wherever else it may arise, in places where there has hitherto been a distributive civilization like that of a peasantry. Capitalism is a monster that grows in deserts. Industrial servitude has almost everywhere arisen in those empty spaces where the older civilization was thin or absent. Thus it grew up easily in the north of England rather than the south, precisely because the north had been comparatively empty and barbarous through all the ages when the south had a civilization of guilds and peasantries. Thus it grew up easily in the American continent rather than the European, precisely because it had nothing to supplant in America but a few savages, while in Europe it had to supplant the culture of multitudinous farms. Everywhere it has been but one stride from the mud hut to the manufacturing town. Everywhere the mud hut which really turned into the free farm has never since moved an inch towards the manufacturing town. Wherever there was the mere lord and the mere serf, they could almost instantly be turned into the mere employer and the mere employee. Wherever there has been the free man, even when he was relatively less rich and powerful, his mere memory has made complete industrial capitalism impossible. It is an enemy that has sown these tares, but even as an enemy he is a coward, for he can only sow them in waste places where no wheat can spring up and choke them. To take up our parable again, we say first that arches exist, and not only exist, but remain. 100 Roman aqueducts and amphitheatres are there to show that they can remain as long or longer than anything else. And if a progressive person informs us that an arch always turns into a factory chimney, or even that an arch always falls down because it is weaker than a factory chimney, or even that wherever it does fall down people perceive that they must replace it by a factory chimney, why, we shall be so audacious as to cast doubts on all these 3 assertions. All we could possibly admit is that the principle supporting the chimney is simpler than the principle of the arch, and for that very reason the factory chimney, like the feudal tower, can rise the more easily in a howling wilderness. But the image has yet a further application. If, at this moment, the Latin countries are largely made our model in the matter of the small property, it is only in the sense in which they would have been through certain periods of history the only exemplars of the arch. There was a time when all arches were Roman arches, and when a man living by the Liffey or the Thames would know as little about them as Mr. Shaw does about peasant proprietors. But that does not mean that we fight for something merely foreign, or advance the arch as a sort of Italian insane, any more than we want to make the Thames as yellow as the Tiber, or have any particular taste in macaroni or malaria. The principle of the arch is human, and applicable to and by all humanity. So is the principle of well-distributed private property. That a few Roman arches stood in ruins in Britain is not a proof that arches cannot be built, but on the contrary, a proof that they can. And now, to complete the coincidence, or analogy, what is the principle of the arch? You can call it, if you like, an affront to gravitation. You will be more correct if you call it an appeal to gravitation. The principle asserts that by combining separate stones of a particular shape in a particular way, we can ensure that their very tendency to fall shall prevent them from falling. And though my image is merely an illustration, it does to a great extent hold even as to the success of more equalized properties. What upholds an arch is an equality of pressure of the separate stones upon each other. The equality is at once mutual aid and mutual obstruction. It is not difficult to show that in a healthy society the moral pressure of different private properties acts in exactly the same way. But if the other school finds the key or comparison insufficient, it must find some other. It is clear that no natural forces can frustrate the fact. To say that any law, such as that of rent, makes against it is true only in the sense that many natural laws make against all morality, and the very essentials of manhood. In that sense, scientific arguments are as irrelevant to our case for property as Mr. Shaw used to say they were to his case against vivisection. Lastly, it is not only true that the arch of property remains, it is true that the building of such arches increases, both in quantity and quality. For instance, the French peasant before the French Revolution was already indefinitely a proprietor. It has made his property more private and more absolute, not less. The French are now less than ever likely to abandon the system, when it has proved for the second, if not the 100th time, the most stable type of prosperity in the stress of war. A revolution as heroic and even more unconquerable has already in Ireland disregarded alike the socialist dream and the capitalist reality, with the driving energy of which no one has yet dared to foresee the limits. So, when the round arch of the Romans and the Normans had remained for ages as a sort of relic, the rebirth of Christendom found for it a further application and issue. It sprang in an instant to the titanic stature of the Gothic, where man seemed to be a god who had hanged his worlds upon nothing. Then was unsealed again something of that ancient secret which had so strangely described the priest as the builder of bridges. And when I look today at some of the bridges which he built above the air, I can understand a man still calling them impossible as their only possible praise. What do we mean by that equality of pressure as of the stones in an arch? More will be said of this in detail, but in general we mean that the modern passion for incessant and restless buying and selling goes along with the extreme inequality of men too rich or too poor. The explanation of the continuity of peasantry, which their opponents are simply forced to leave unexplained, is that where that independence exists, it is valued exactly as any other dignity is valued when it is regarded as normal to a man, as no man goes naked or is beaten with a stick for hire. The theory that those who start reasonably equal cannot remain reasonably equal is a fallacy founded entirely on a society in which they start extremely unequal. It is true that when capitalism has passed a certain point, the broken fragments of property are very easily devoured. In other words, it is true when there is a small amount of small property, but it is quite untrue when there is a large amount of small property. To argue from what happened in the rush of big business, in the rout of scattered small businesses, to what must always happen when the parties are more on a level, is quite illogical. It is proving from Niagara that there is no such thing as a lake. Once tip up the lake, and the whole of the water will rush one way, as the whole economic tendency of capitalist inequality rushes one way. Leave the lake as a lake, or the level as a level, and there is nothing to prevent the lake remaining until the crack of doom, as many levels of peasantry seem likely to remain until the crack of doom. This fact is proved by experience, even if it is not explained by experience, but, as a matter of fact, it is possible to suggest not only the experience, but the explanation. The truth is that there is no economic tendency whatever toward the disappearance of small property until that property becomes so very small as to cease to act as property at all. If one man has 100 acres, and another man has half an acre, it is likely enough that he will be unable to live on half an acre. Then there will be an economic tendency for him to sell his land and make the other man the proud possessor of 150. But if one man has 30 acres, and the other man has 40 acres, there is no economic tendency of any kind whatever to make the first man sell to the second. It is simply false to say that the first man cannot be secure of 30, or the second man content with 40. It is sheer nonsense. Like saying that any man who owns a bull terrier will be bound to sell it to somebody who owns a mastiff. It is like saying that I cannot own a horse because I have an eccentric neighbor who owns an elephant. Needless to say, those who insist that roughly equalized ownership cannot exist base their whole argument on the notion that it has existed. They have to suppose, in order to prove their point, that people in England, for instance, did begin as equals and rapidly reached inequality. And it only rounds off the humour of their whole position that they assume the existence of what they call an impossibility in the one case in which it has really not occurred. They talk as if 10 miners had run a race, and one of them became the Duke of Northumberland. They talk as if the first Rothschild was a peasant who patiently planted better cabbages than the other peasants. The truth is that England became a capitalist country because it had long been an oligarchical country. It would be much harder to point out in what way a country like Denmark need become oligarchical, but the case is even stronger when we add the ethical to the economic common sense. When there is once established a widely scattered ownership, there is a public opinion that is stronger than any law, and very often, what in modern times is even more remarkable, a law that is really an expression of public opinion. It may be very difficult for modern people to imagine a world in which men are not generally admired for covetousness and crushing their neighbours, but I assure them that such strange patches of an earthly paradise do really remain on earth. The truth is that this first objection of impossibility in the abstract flies flat in the face of all the facts of experience and human nature. It is not true that a moral custom cannot hold most men content with a reasonable status, and careful to preserve it. It is as if we were to say that because some men are more attractive to women than others, therefore the inhabitants of Bolham under Queen Victoria could not possibly have been arranged on a monogamous model, with one man, one wife. Sooner or later, it might be said, all females would be found clustering round the fascinating few, and nothing but bachelorhood be left for the unattractive many. Sooner or later, the suburb must consist of 100 hermitages and 3 harems. But this is not the case. It is not the case at present, whatever may happen if the moral tradition of marriage is really lost in Bolham. So long as that moral tradition is alive, so long as stealing other people's wives is reprobated or being faithful to a spouse is admired, there are limits to the extent to which the wildest profligate in Bolham can disturb the balance of the sexes. So any land-grabber would very rapidly find that there were limits to the extent to which he could buy up land in an Irish or Spanish or Serbian village. When it is really thought hateful to take Naboth's vineyard, as it is to take Uriah's wife, there is little difficulty in finding a local prophet to pronounce the judgment of the Lord. In an atmosphere of capitalism, the man who lays field to field is flattered, but in an atmosphere of property, he is promptly jeered at, or possibly stoned. The result is that the village has not sunk into plutocracy, or the suburb into polygamy. Property is a point of honour. The true contrary of the word property is the word prostitution. And it is not true that a human being will always sell what is sacred to that sense of self-ownership, whether it be the body or the boundary. A few do it in both cases, and by doing it they always become outcasts. But it is not true that a majority must do it, and anybody who says it is ignorant, not of our plans and proposals, not of anybody's visions and ideals, not of distributism or division of capital by this or that process, but of the facts of history, in the substance of humanity. He is a barbarian who has never seen an arch. In the notes I have here jotted down, it will be obvious, of course, that the restoration of this pattern, simple as it is much more complicated in a complicated society. Here I have only traced it in its simplest form as it stood, and still stands, at the beginning of our discussion. I disregard the view that such reaction cannot be. I hold the old mystical dogma that what man has done, man can do. My critics seem to hold a still more mystical dogma, that man cannot possibly do a thing because he has done it. That is what seems to be meant by saying that small property is antiquated. It really means that all property is dead. There is nothing to be reached upon the present lines except the increasing loss of property by everybody as something swallowed up into a system equally impersonal and inhuman, whether we call it communism or capitalism. If we cannot go back, it hardly seems worthwhile to go forward. There is nothing in front but a flat wilderness of standardization either by Bolshevism or big business. But it is strange that some of us should have seen sanity, if only in a vision, while the rest of us go forward chained eternally to enlargement without liberty and progress without hope.